Hello, I'm John Garen, BB&T Professor of Economics at the University of Kentucky, and an affiliate of the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise. The protection of one's person and property against the unwanted incursions of another is a central role of government in a free society and in a free enterprise economy. This applies to the unwanted harms or risks that are imposed upon one person by another as well. And this is where the government role in the coronavirus epidemic comes about. However, the severity of the response has been quite unusual. There have been widespread economic shutdowns as well as other restrictions on personal behavior. So this warrants a careful look at what's been going on and the policy-wise, both at the costs and the benefits. In particular, let's consider COVID fatalities compared to fatalities that occur from the flu and general fatalities. So sadly, in Kentucky through April the 8th, 73 people have succumbed to the coronavirus. Let's compare that, however, to flu and pneumonia deaths in 2018, which is the last full year of complete data that's publicly available, 969. Still a relatively small number compared to flu and pneumonia deaths, and smaller yet compared to all deaths. So Kentucky is not what one would call a hot spot regarding COVID. Texas is another state that has a relatively low fatality rate due to COVID compared to flu and pneumonia, 193 compared to over 3,500 flu and pneumonia deaths in 2018. This is in contrast, however, to New York. New York has had a very high number of COVID deaths, over 6,200, more than the number of deaths due to flu and pneumonia throughout the entirety of 2018. The point of this is to illustrate that the severity of the crisis varies a lot from place to place, and so policy ought to vary from place to place as well. Thinking about policy in this context, we should be thinking about changes in risk as well as trade-offs. To give an example, let's consider a restriction on economic activity or other activity that causes a 1 in 10,000 reduction in the probability of death. If this policy affects 10,000 people, one life is saved. If it affects 1 million people, 100 lives are saved. However, severe economic restrictions also cause hardship. Hardship oftentimes causes ill health, which leads to an increased chance of fatality. So if the increased economic hardships cause a 1/10,000th increase in the probability of fatality, then all of the restrictions, the lives saved through the restrictions, are completely undone. So we need to be cognizant of this in the policy making, that the stakes are high either way. Too few and too many restrictions are harmful. Moreover, people, of course, want safety, but not at any cost. Otherwise, we never drive our cars and we never and run the risk of an accident by doing so. Now let's take a look at one aspect of the cost, and that's lost income, which translates to lost GDP. Estimates indicate that the second quarter GDP growth for 2020 will be negative 30%, meaning incomes will be lower by 30% than they otherwise would have been. This is quite severe. In fact, the worst quarter of growth during the Great Recession was a negative 8.4%. So this upcoming quarter is forecast to be way worse than the worst of the Great Recession. Now, some people will get federal assistance, but fundamentally there will be fewer goods and services available. Somebody bears this burden. To address some of the problems caused by the widespread economic shutdowns and the lost income, Congress passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Stabilization Act. Some of the provisions are following. There's direct payments to families and individuals. There's a federal top-off of unemployment insurance. There's forgivable loans to small businesses so that they maintain their payroll. There's loans to large business. There's aid to state and local governments. Unfortunately, there's also a dollop of pork in it, and it all adds up to $2.2 trillion. Now, this should be thought of as aid and relief. It's not an economic stimulus. As long as businesses remain shuttered, fewer goods and services are going to be produced. So all the economic aid here simply moves the resources around. It doesn't change the total amount that's produced. So fundamentally, to have a recovery, that economic production needs to get going again. The large expenditures associated with the coronavirus relief bill also raises some issues about the future costs imposed on the economy by the policy responses. Consider the federal budget 2020. Before the CARES Act, spending was slated to be $4.8 trillion with a budget deficit of $1.1 trillion. Both very large numbers. After the CARES Act, these are slated to be $7 trillion in spending, federal spending, a 46% increase, and $3.3 trillion deficit, a tripling of the deficit. Percentages of GDP, these numbers have not been seen since the aftermath of World War II. Now, to deal with this high levels of debt, what that means is taxes are going to go up in the future. Now, if we have a robust, growing economy, that makes it the higher taxes in the future more manageable. But a higher tax bill is going to slow the economy, which makes that more problematic. After World War II, this was handled because government spending was going down and the economy was beginning to boom. But right now, the federal budget already is in trouble. We have lots of deficits and debt presently, and it looks like going forward. So this is going to impose an even more difficult burden on future generations. A lot of what I've said here is highlighting the costs, both present and future, of the policy responses we've seen so far. Now, just because there's costs doesn't mean nothing should be done. There's a downside, a very serious downside of doing too little about the coronavirus. There's also a serious downside of trying to do too much. We can shut down the economy and make the cure worse than the disease. So I think it's time we start thinking very carefully now about these economic restrictions. In fact, let's think about sort of the marginal restriction, the last restriction put in place. How much is it reducing the spread of disease, and how much of it is lowering GDP and costing consumers and producers around the economy? I am very concerned some of the last restrictions, or the marginal restrictions, have a very trivial effect on health and reducing the spread of the disease, have very, very large effects on the economy. So I think it's time to start, particularly in selected areas, start smart reopening, where we reopen where the risk of spreading the disease is low, but the benefits to the economy are very high. Unfortunately, political incentives often weigh heavily in situations like these. Politicians want to make themselves look good by, quote, doing something, whether or not it really has much of a positive effect or not. We need better from our politicians and policymakers right now. The stakes are just too high.